Hello watch enthusiasts, and welcome to this fourth episode of the highlights of Watches and Wonders. Now, in today's episode I'd like to speak about Panerai. And Panerai have gone in an interesting direction with their Luminor watches this year, which are celebrating their 70th anniversary after being first launched in 1950. Before I begin, remember that you can find full articles about the watches in this podcast on the Watch Chronicler website, and much more, so do head over there for more detail and to learn a bit more about some of the most interesting pieces released during this year's Watches and Wonders. Now, when I first opened the document sent to me by Panerai's media team last week, I was rather surprised by the number of Luminor watches being released, and there really was a multitude of them in terms of new variants with new cases, different dial arrangement, different choices of case backs. And I must admit that it was at first quite complicated to figure out what was of interest and what wasn't, because there was just such a sheer number of new releases. And the fact, if I allow myself the indiscretion, the fact that a lot of the documents and photos were mislabeled didn't help. But putting that aside, there were a few pieces which didn't make it into today's video, including the PAM 01112, which is a traditional looking Luminor but with a gold tech case, which is a mix of brass and gold to give a warmer, redder sort of colour. But this only had a 50 metre water resistance, which for a 44mm dive watch strikes me as strange. They also released the PAM 1661, which is a carbotech model with blue accents on the dial, except in a traditional style of Luminor way, with traditional hands and a traditional dial arrangement, which acts as a sort of a small version of the Lab ID released a couple of years ago, which was a very complicated and very elaborate piece, which was due to not need lubrication within the movement due to new materials being employed, and this was sort of a light version. But I think the most interesting trio was a trio of limited editions of 270 pieces, which have been put out for the 70th anniversary of the Luminor. And these, whilst they're not classed in a single category, they follow the same general design in terms of case design, case construction, and an interesting application of Super-LumiNova to these watches, which I'll get to in a moment. And these are the PAM 01117, the PAM 01118, and the PAM 01119. And these all form parts of the same collection. There are 270 pieces of each, and they all come with 44mm cases and 300m water resistances. They also all use the same movement, which is the Panerai 9010, which is an automatic 3-day movement in their collection, which has been around for a while and which is a popular choice for automatic Luminors in particular, because whilst it's not a particularly slender movement, it does give the longer power reserve and the practicality of automatic winding, which is something appealing to have, especially when the crown is a bit more fiddly than something you'd find on something like a Radiomir, which just has a threaded screw-down crown. But to understand these watches, you have to look at the way Panerai's been going over the last few years. Now, since its recreation in the 1990s, Panerai has enjoyed particular popularity within a group of enthusiasts, but it has become a largely enjoyed product as a design amongst people who just enjoy the history of military diving or the aquatic connections that Panerai has. But they do have one design, in essence. Granted, they have it arranged into 4 different ranges within their wider collection, within the Luminor and Radiomir lines, but the cushion shape and vintage style is something which is a standard for the brand, and I think that in recent years they've been trying to move away from this in some ways, but I can see why it would be difficult for a brand with this particular aesthetic. And so they've become pioneers where materials are concerned. We've seen titanium ceramic cases, carbon cases, and they've added some new materials this year which are highlighted by this collection. Now, the most affordable watch in this collection at €16,000, and actually I'll come to the price later because this is important, and actually there's something quite important behind the price, is that aside from being a limited edition of 270 pieces, this watch is a watch with a 44mm diameter and a 14.5mm thickness, and it's made from carbotech, which is layers of compressed carbon fibre, which creates a sort of a polymer, which is significantly lighter than steel, but is a stronger material in terms of cracking and shattering than ceramic. Bearing in mind the size of these cases, I could understand why they would want to not go down the ceramic route in order to avoid the brittle nature of that particular material. And so this forms a 300-metre dive watch, admittedly without the bezel in traditional Panerai form. But a feature this watch has, which is shared with the other models in this range, is the addition of X1 Super-LumiNova to a lot more of the case and dial than you would normally see. Notably, it's been added in these bands around the edge of the crystal, in addition to the sandwich dial placed beneath the dial, to the hands, to the crown guard, as well as the crown itself, if you look at it down the side of the case, and the lever which controls the crown. And the result is a pretty spectacular glowing experience if you want something which really stands out. And I think with the black veined and patterned colour and appearance of this carbotech case, you really do get quite an incredible watch for the price. Certainly something very different, and I think that different is important for Panerai at the moment. Now, another aspect of this collection to bear in mind is the fact that they haven't just stopped at carbotech, they have gone down other directions. Now, logically, the next piece to look at is the PAM 0117, or 1117 rather, which is a 44mm watch with a similar case design, but it's a bit thicker at 15.65mm, and I can't figure out why it's thicker because it uses the same automatic 3-day movement running at 3 Hz, but I assume it's down to the construction. Because this watch uses sandblasted titanium, but something which Panerai seem to have neglected to put on part of their press release and the specifications is the fact that this watch actually falls into the DMLS collection. Now, what that means is that this case isn't just titanium in the standard sense. This is titanium which is more or less made by 3D printing. It's a sintered titanium case, whereby powder is applied and formed through a constructive process, an additive process, rather than a reductive process as you normally have with cases where metal is polished away. Here it's added. And the result is that this watch only weighs 100 grams despite its considerable size. And the reason for that is because this metal can be hollow. And I appreciate that that may concern a few people in terms of the risks of having a hollow metal case. But the result is a watch which is very light, has the same strength as you would normally see from titanium, but which provides a more comfortable experience for the wearer. Now, the design of this watch is also similar to the carbon version. So one sees the fact that this watch has a dull matte grey colour to it, because it's also sandblasted, and it has a sunburst blue dial as opposed to the sunburst black dial on the carbon version. I must say I rather like this. I think it's an appealing way of using titanium, but without the risks of the titanium ceramic cases which they've produced in recent years, which, whilst interesting, for me just pose too much of a risk, especially in the much larger cases, the 47mm cases, which those watches were formerly made in. The luminosity on this watch is also the same, with the same approach to the case and dial lume. And the final watch is a very interesting one, and this is Fibratech. Now, Fibratech is a proprietary approach to making cases, and it's been used formerly in the aerospace industry, where basalt, the rock basalt, is made into a powder and then melted and then drawn into a fibre. At this point, it can then be mixed with a polymer and baked in a similar way to carbon fibre. And so you get this very strong, light material, which has the same sort of fibrous strength as a carbon fibre or carbon composite case. The difference here is that it's biodegradable as well, which is an interesting concept, an interesting direction. I don't know what relevance that has to a watch, but nonetheless it's an interesting concept. And the colour here is lighter than the carbotech case, and is in fact comparable to the titanium case, but with a bit of a green sort of beige colour added in. And this one uses a sunburst grey dial, and I think of the three this is the most interesting. Now, the price for the titanium and Fibratech models is higher at €19,000. But the one thing with all of these watches which is interesting to consider is the fact that these watches have a 70-year warranty, which is pretty mad, really, when you think about it. It's a warranty which will no doubt move into servicing intervals. So that's really why you're paying the additional money here, because you're getting that paid at the start of things rather than further down the line, which is certainly an interesting concept, and I think it opens new doors in terms of what brands could offer in future. Now, I realise this is only done because these are very limited editions, and that's why these are so much more expensive than standard watches. The reality is that these don't represent particularly good value for money in terms of what you're getting physically. But I do find the concept of a 70-year warranty quite interesting, and I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about this in the comment section. Now, the final watch I'd like to speak about in this video is the Panerai Luminor Eco-Pangaea Tourbillon GMT. And this is certainly an oddity in the Panerai range and reuses a movement which we've seen before from Panerai, which is the manually wound P2005T. And that T means tourbillon, because this movement is a rather enormous GMT tourbillon movement, which has an interesting rotating tourbillon around the 10 o'clock mark, which it doesn't rotate horizontally in relation to the dial, but vertically. So you get this interesting 30-second rotation, which I think is very exciting to watch. But what's most interesting about this watch is that it's been released in another collaboration for the second year running with the explorer Mike Horn. Now, I think this comes as a form of reinvention for Panerai, trying to offer something new and provide a new inspiration around their watches, and they've looked to conservation and exploration. Because this watch isn't what you would expect, really, and certainly it took some reading through the details about this to really get an idea of what was going on here, because the case isn't your normal stainless steel, except, of course, it is as beautifully finished. I must say the way the bezel is executed with the polished surface and the matte back really looks excellent. But this is a case which is made from reclaimed, recycled steel from the drive shaft of the Pangaea vessel, which has been used by Mike Horn during exploration. And so this metal, I suppose, has been taken around the world in a functional capacity before being turned into a watch case. And I don't know what sort of steel alloy it is, because it's certainly not your normal 316L stainless steel, but I'll be very curious to find out more as more information surfaces. And this is a very, very limited run of only 5 pieces, selling for €190,000. Now that's an enormous amount of money, of course, but in terms of the mechanical features you get, this watch isn't lacking. The design from the front is pretty mad if you look at it, with the blue colour on the hands as well as the GMT hand and the day-night 24-hour indicator. And to add a more rugged feel to this watch, they've added hexagonal bolts to the movement rather than using normal screws, which is a curious sort of look. Otherwise, the design is very much that of a Luminor submersible, with the rotating bezel, the 300-metre water resistance, and an enormous 50mm case, which is something which I think that people will have to assess as they want it, but I'm sure that there'll be no shortage of people to buy this watch. What's perhaps most interesting, apart from the fact that this watch still has a 6-day power reserve despite having a GMT and 30-second tourbillon setup, as well as a power reserve indicator, is the fact that this watch comes with an adventure, so to speak. So with this watch, you get the opportunity to go on an Arctic adventure with Mike Horn for the 5 people who end up buying this watch. And I find this quite interesting because their previous models released with this style took a very different approach, in the sense that they were very clearly sports watches. But this is something else. This is granted a watch with sporting capabilities, but it's something for a collector, and so I'll be very curious to see how well received the idea of going on an Arctic trip is after buying the watch, because it's certainly a curious concept. But that concludes today's video about the 2020 Watches and Wonders releases. But tell me what you thought in the comment section below, and do follow us on Instagram to be able to see the latest in terms of new releases, articles and podcasts. And as a hint, there's a very interesting podcast coming up tomorrow with the man who brought back the Fears watch company in the UK, which I hope you'll enjoy. But anyway, do like, share and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching. This is Armon from WatchChronicle.com. Out.